Izuku was excited, for later that day his mother would be taking him to see a doctor to learn what his quirk was. Every kid in his class already had their quirks, and Izuku just loved seeing them. His best friend Katsuki Bakugo could fire out an explosion from his nitroglycerin-like sweat. Bakugo was already talking about how he was going to be a top hero. Izuku hoped he got a cool quirk like that so he could fight alongside his best friend. He was so excited. So for the past few days, Izuku had been trying to use his mother's telekinesis quirk and his father's flame breath quirk. Yet he didn't show signs of being able to use either of their quirks. Despite this, Izuku was still excited. He couldn't wait until he learned what quirk he had so he could begin training to become a hero. He was sitting in the last period of kindergarten class. His feet were swinging under his chair waiting for the bell to ring so he could dash to meet his mom out in the car. "All right, class," the teacher said, struggling to keep the kids' attention for the last few minutes of class, which was a common struggle on Fridays, even with high schoolers. "I know it's almost the weekend, but it is important that you pay attention until the bell rings." Re-evening. Izuku didn't have time to hear the teacher cursing the bell. As he jumped up, grabbed his stuff, and ran out the door. He rushed down the hallway, heading straight for the forward door, ready to learn what his quirk was. As he rounded the last corner, he spotted his mom waiting for him past the front door. Once he reached the front door, he pushed it open and ran into her outstretched arms. "How's my little baby?" Inko said, cuddling her only son, her pride and joy, and the most important thing to her in her life. Inko rubbed her son's hair, ruffling it up. "How was school?" "I'm good. I'm so excited to learn what my quirk is," Izuku said, jumping up and down as Inko walked him to the car. The entire ride Izuku was bouncing in his seat, yet Inko could only smile whenever she looked at him through the rearview mirror. She had done this since her only son had been trying to use a quirk and every time failed to do so. As Izuku's doctor's appointment got closer, she was increasing worry that Izuku might be quirkless. Eventually, they arrived at the doctor's office. After several tests and a blood draw, the two greenheads found themselves in a room waiting in a basic doctor's room. Izuku was reading a book, while Inko twirled her hair between her fingers. She had been to the doctor enough times to know that if a doctor was taking this longer, it could only mean bad news. Inko said a silent prayer to whatever god was listening that her son did for a quirk, and it would be perfect to make him a hero. She had a friend in high school that had been quirkless, and with the discrimination her friend had, Inko won't wish that on her worst enemy. Izuku was a kind soul, and Inko didn't want the world to destroy it. As Inko finished this silent prayer, a small knock came from the door. Inko released a breath she didn't know she had been holding as she watched the door open. A short doctor walked in, carrying a weird device Inko thought she recognized from the engineering class her husband took. "Hello, Mrs. Sataku. How have you been on this wonderful day?" the doctor asked in a calming voice as if he was able to deliver some bad news. "Anxious to say the least. My son, Izuku, has been so excited the past few days to learn what his quirk is. He's been trying to use my telekinesis and my husband's flame breath." Inko had become worried after seeing their Izuku didn't have either of their quirks. "I assume with not much luck," the doctor guessed, and Inko shook her head. He could see the worry on Inko's face. He had seen it on a lot of parents when their children didn't show obvious signs of having a quirk. "Well, Mrs. Sataku, after looking at the test, it was clear that Izuku didn't inherit either your or your husband's quirk." "Is he quirkless?" Inko asked, her mind just forcing the question out. She needed to know. After not seeing either quirk demonstrated by her son, she had begun to fear the worst. "He is not. He does have a quirk, however, it is not heritage. It in itself is completely unique to him." The sentence caused Izuku to look up from his book. "Izuku, I want you to understand something. Our mind runs off static impulses. It's what allows our brains to send signals to different parts of our bodies." Izuku listened attentively to the doctor as he continued to explain. "However, too much of this static electricity can cause nerve damage. However, by running a blood test, we saw that not only is your body holding a high amount of static electricity, it is also producing it." "Is that dangerous for him?" Inko asked. The doctor's words were folding upon themselves. She was getting confused. The doctor held out a hand while he grabbed the strange device. "This is a multimeter, which is used to measure voltage, current, and resistance. It's been modified to handle high amounts produced by lightning quirk. Izuku, could you hold these two metal poles? Izuku nodded as he reached forwards and grabbed the two metal prongs the doctor held out. After turning on the machine and checking a few things, the doctor turned the device to Inko and Izuku. Normally, a person's body cannot withstand 42 voltage with a current of 0.1 ampere for 2 seconds. That sounds low, Izuku said. He understood a bit about electricity from the paper his father wrote for his degree. It surprisingly is. That is why electricity is so dangerous. However, this device reads the Izuku body currently holds 105 volts with a current of 10 amperes. Yet at the same time, Izuku is as healthy as can be. To answer your earlier question, Izuku's quirk, which I've come to call static cell, appears to allow him to hold a large amount of electricity within his body. Will he/I be able to fire off the electricity? Izuku and Inko asked at the same time. Izuku imagined himself as a powerful hero, being able to take out multiple villains with a single attack. Inko was imagining all the potential fire hazards Izuku could cause. The doctor smirked as they asked their question at the same time. He pulled out his cell phone. Izuku, I would like you to concentrate on this cell phone and try to shoot a bolt of lighting. Izuku nodded and turned his full attention to the cell phone. His face narrowed to show the amount of focus he had. After a few seconds, nothing happened. While it is common for people with electricity-based quirks to be able to discharge it as lighting, it seems Izuku will not. However, when most electricity-based quirks form, they are only about to produce about 10 volts. It appears at the cost of being unable to discharge, Izuku's body is able to produce more electricity. The doctor placed the phone in Izuku's outstretched hand. So the wireless charging port was up, so unless you have a material that is superconductive, the static electricity in your body will never have a chance to leave your body. The doctor turned the phone over so the wireless charging port was touching Izuku's skin. However, if you can use a material such as this phone charger port, the electricity will slowly flow between your body and the material. Izuku looked at his hand and saw a small spark of green electricity jump occasionally between his hand and the phone. The phone screen lit up, showing that it was charging. Izuku stopped paying attention as Inko continued to ask the doctor questions about Izuku's mutant quirk. In the end, the doctor stated, "Your son is perfectly healthy, and I see no change that needs to occur to keep him healthy." Inko thanked the doctor and Izuku handed back the doctor his phone. As the mother and child left, the doctor turned his phone back on and saw that unlike before his phone had a full battery. The doctor laughed at the comedy provided by that thought. "So I still can be a hero," was the first thing Izuku said he got home. Inko had begun to worry about Izuku and him slipping into depression when he didn't say anything the entire car ride home. He was normally a talkative and chirpy kid, so his current attitude didn't look good. Inko frowned at Izuku's comment. While in itself was great, the tone Izuku used didn't sound hopeful. Inko knew she needed to help her son. "That's great, Izuku. You will be one of the great heroes in the world." Inko hugged her son. Izuku smiled a bit because of his mother's comment. "Yeah, I can be the world's greatest hero. That just means I'll have to work extra because of my quirk. Yeah, I can be a hero." Inko opened the front door to their apartment and allowed Izuku to walk in. "Hey Zuzu, can you go to your room? I need to talk with your father." Inko set a smile on her face. Izuku smiled back and ran to his room. He was curious about what his parents were going to talk about, so he left the door open. "So whose did he get?" Izuku heard his father ask. He hadn't been able to go to the doctor's appointment due to work. He had just barely arrived home before his wife and son did. Neither. Izuku heard a few books hit the floor. Izuku couldn't tell whether it was out of anger or surprise, but he knew his father had knocked the books over. He's not quirkless. He has his own unique quirk. The doctor called it static cell. Izuku's body is able to produce a high amount of electricity. However, to balance it out, he can fire it off as lightning. So he's basically a battery. Izuku heard his father laugh. It was a kind laugh that came out as if Izuku's father had heard a funny joke. It warmed Izuku's heart a bit. Inko said, tears coming to the edge of her eyes. "Hisashi, I'm serious." Inko had tears forming in her eyes. Izuku still wants to become a hero. But his quirk isn't like the others. I don't see how he could use it to fight or protect himself. What if he becomes a hero but can't control his quirk? He can seriously get hurt. Familiar with his wife's waterworks, even before they got married, Hisashi was ready. He stood up and wrapped his crying wife in a big hug and kissed her forehead. Hey, Inko, it's going to be fine. I still have contact with some old friends of mine. I'm sure I can get their help with this issue. If my son wants to become a hero, then I'll find a solution. Izuku has a kind heart and wants to help people, so I'm going to make sure that I can help him become that kind of hero. I will create a way for our son to become a hero. Over the weekend, Izuku tried to experiment with his quirk. He tried complex things like turning on and off electronics from a distance to more simple things like recharging dead batteries. Yet nothing worked, but Izuku didn't get discouraged. He kept his hopes high. But then the weekend was over and he went back to school. As homeroom started, Izuku was called to the front of the classroom. He was asked to demonstrate his quirk, though after a few moments, Izuku couldn't think of anything. Then he recalled how the doctor had shown how he was able to recharge a phone. Izuku turned and looked at his teacher and asked for her phone. She gave a confused thought, but withdrew her phone and handed it to Izuku. Izuku turned it on and saw it was low on power, perfect to show off his quirk. He held up the phone as if presenting it at an expo, then pressed his fingers into the back of the wireless charger. After a few seconds, the phone turned on, showing that it was charged. More than that, the phone was charging quickly and within a few seconds reached 100%. Izuku then quickly withdrew his phone from the back of the phone, then handed it back to his teacher. She looked over the phone and saw it was fully charged. Oh, I must have forgotten to plug it in last night. So you can control electricity. Izuku's best friend Bakugo said. Yeah, can you shoot out electricity? A kid asked. Izuku shook his head. The doctor states that I won't be able to naturally produce lightning, though my quirk is more powerful than most electric-based quirks. Bakugo laughed. What's the point of having a powerful quirk if you can't use it? You're just a large battery then. The rest of the class began laughing along with Bakugo. You have such a useless quirk. I would rather be quirkless. Then you would have an excuse for being so useless. There is no way you can become a hero with a quirk you can't use. Izuku looked over the class as they began to laugh. Izuku thought about what the doctor had said. He was able to produce more electricity than most electric-based quirks ever could. Yet there was no way for him to discharge his quirk, so maybe Bakugo was right. If he couldn't use it, then he wouldn't be able to become a hero. Izuku let out a small sigh as his head and shoulders dropped. He somberly walked back to his desk and sat down. He put his arms on the desk and used them to cover the majority of his face as he looked up at the board. Thank you for that demonstration of your quirk, Izuku, the teacher said, making no note of the harassment from the other kids. Izuku didn't pay attention to the rest of the class, just sat wallowing in his own self-pity. He sat alone at lunch, not listening to anyone talk about him. He only listened in class, not answering any of the questions. Once the bell had rung, Izuku quietly got his materials in his backpack and then quickly walked out of the school. He said nothing as Inko drove him home, and he headed directly for his room. He sat on his bed, his all-night blanket covering him. He was crying when a knock came on the door. Are you feeling all right, Izuku? His mom asked. Why is my quirk so useless? Izuku cried from under his blanket. Inko took in a sharp breath. It was clear his quirk demonstration hadn't ended on a good note. Inko slowly opened the door to see her son sitting on his bed with the blinds closed. It was a complete 180 from how he normally acted. School must have been really harsh. Izuku, honey, your quirk is not useless. It's powerful, and I'm sure that one day you'll achieve great things with it. Your quirk might not be as straightforward as others, but I'm sure you'll find a way to use it. Look at Whiplash. Inko knew he wasn't exactly the best hero to use for an example, but he was the first one she thought of. His quirk doesn't allow him to shoot out lightning, but he uses equipment to defeat villains. That did little to cheer up Izuku, as he just covered himself more with his covers. Inko took a small shallow breath as she walked over to Izuku's bed and sat down next to her son. Then as she began rubbing circles on his back, she said, I have faith in your Izuku. You'll find a way to become a great hero. Inko continued to try and comfort her son until it was time for her to start dinner. Dinner brought a small smile to Izuku, but after the table was cleared up, he quickly disappeared back into his room. Izuku sat on his bed, with his door cracked so he could hear his mother and father talk. So, I take it that his demonstration didn't do so well, Hisashi said as he cleared the plates from the table and took them over to the sink. He began rinsing them off until he noticed the downtrodden look on Inko's face. Kids really don't have any filter. They are even worse than alcoholics, Inko said, and Hisashi chuckled. Inko threw a damp towel at her husband. Hisashi, I'm being serious. Izuku has only had his quirk for a bit, and he's always thinking it's useless. Hisashi walked over to his wife and hugged her from behind. Come on, Izuku is a smart kid, and he's always talking about how much he wants to become a hero. I'm sure he'll find a way, and you and I will always be there to help him out. I had some calls back from some of my old colleagues. They all have promise, and they love a good challenge. It doesn't matter how long or how hard it is. I will help our son become a hero. At that point, Izuku got up and walked over to his door. He closed it and then walked back to his bed. Izuku slipped back under the cover and soon was falling asleep, with the hope that tomorrow was going to be better. Unfortunately, the next day was not that good. From the moment Izuku stepped into school to the moment Izuku left for home, he was constantly made fun of for his quote-unquote useless quirk. And that's how the following week, then a month, then 2 months went by. The only light Izuku had in his day-to-day life was when Hisashi was home in time for dinner. After dinner was cleaned up, Hisashi would bring Izuku into the master room and show him what he and his colleague had been working on. Yet, even that didn't last long. As the years came and went, Hisashi was making it home for dinner less and less. And at some point, Izuku couldn't remember when, but Hisashi began coming home less and less. It became more and more common that Hisashi would only call home and inform Inko and Izuku of any progress he had made. Izuku would hang on to every word his father said, but soon those phone calls stopped, only leaving Izuku to wonder what had happened to his father, and with Izuku's fragile mind, he couldn't help but think what everyone was saying was true. He had a powerful but useless quirk, one that Izuku would never be able to become a hero with. Was that why his father had abandoned Izuku and Inko, with all he had done to help Izuku become a hero? Had Hisashi learned the truth that everyone seemed to know, Izuku could never become a hero. And it seemed Inko saw Hisashi's act as abandonment too, as eventually she took down all the photos of Hisashi and switched back to her maiden name. Izuku couldn't help but think that was all because of his quirk. If only he had been born with a quirk he was actually about to use. Over the coming years, hearing less from his father and hearing more from his classmates, Izuku began to become depressed. He barely talked in class and would only give quick responses when called on, mainly keeping to himself, writing in his journals for future hero analysis. At home it wasn't any better. He would board himself in his room. He always claimed he was working on homework, but with his intelligence, he easily finished any assignment he was given. Through all this, Izuku tried to hold out hope that one day Hisashi would come home. But the only clue he was still alive was that Inko received monthly checks to take care of the bills. Until one day the checks stopped, and Inko received the worst noise of her life. Izuku had gone off to school, and Inko had spent her time cleaning the house. She had just finished the living room when a knock came from the door. Inko flickered the towel over her shoulder, then headed over to the front door. Inko opened the door and found a slender woman dressed in a gray suit. She held a briefcase in her hands and had an empathic look on her face. The woman locked eyes with Inko and asked, "Are you Inko Sataku?" "Midoriya. I no longer go by my ex-husband's name," Inko said as she looked the formally dressed woman up and down. "Ex-husband?" The woman questioned, and Inko nodded. The legal firm was not informed that there was a divorce. "Not officially, but after Hisashi left me and my son, I went back to my maiden name." "You said you were from a legal firm," Inko said. Hisashi and Inko's names were still both on the title to the house, car, and everything else. As Inko had officially filed for divorce, everything was still under the name Sataku. "Yes, Mrs. Midoriya, I regret to inform you that a week ago Hisashi Sataku was found dead. In his will, he left everything to you," the woman said. Inko froze as the woman's words connected in her mind. Hisashi was dead. She didn't care for him as much as she had when they were first married, and she didn't think of him as her husband anymore. Yet to suddenly hear that Hisashi was dead, Inko stumbled back and nearly fainted. Inko caught herself and managed to walk back to the couch and fell into it. The woman walked in and laid her briefcase on the coffee table. She opened it and pulled out a thick binding folder, laying it down on the coffee table. Mrs. Midoriya, Hisashi Sataku had a lot to his name. He had many patents under his name and a large sum of money to his name. The woman then opened the folder and began to read. Being of sound mind and body, I, Hisashi Midoriya, leave the following. To my wife, Inko Hisashi/Midoriya, the sole owner to the title of the house of 2145 W. Stop. Inko then repeated herself in a stronger voice. Stop. I don't care for Hisashi Sataku or his money. He abandoned our son and left me to raise me by myself. I don't care what my ex-husband left me or my son. I won't accept anything of his. So just leave. The woman didn't seem fazed by Inko's outburst. I understand, Mrs. Midoriya. However, Mr. Sataku left a clause in his will that nothing is to happen to his possession, except for being passed into your hands. He even set aside a storage unit to be purchased to hold his possessions until you were ready to accept it. I don't care for anything of his, Inko said. The woman closed her briefcase as she nodded and stood up. She then walked to the still open front door and grabbed a box from the front porch. Among everything in Hisashi's possession, this was the only box that he stated needed to be given to you, even if it was by force. The woman said as she carried the box in and placed it on the coffee table. I said I don't want anything from my ex-husband, Inko said as she stood up and went for the box. Yet she was stopped as the woman grabbed Inko's arm. In his will, Hisashi wrote that this box needed to be protected at all cost from everyone. He specifically included you on that list of people. However, he wrote that he regretted having to add your name. So as welfare legal firm, if you are suspected to be any danger to this box, we are allowed to take legal actions against you. I can assure you do not want that to happen. Inko huffed and said, Fine, I'll keep his damn box safe. Inko was just going to hide it in the back of her closet where she didn't have to see or think about it. The woman nodded and began making her way back to the front door. As she walked through it, she stopped and looked back at Inko. You might not want your ex-husband's stuff, but it's there for you. Keep the folder when you want it, sign the papers, and bring it to welfare legal firm. Until then, Hisashi Sataku's assets will be waiting to be claimed. With that, the woman left, and Inko was left by herself to look at the will and the box. Inko didn't know how long she stayed looking at the items. But eventually, Inko grabbed the folder and the box and carried them to her closet. She rammed the closet door open and shoved the box and folder into the back, behind her old wedding dress that she hadn't sold yet. As Inko began to close the closet, her eyes fell on her wedding dress. She no longer fit in, having gained some weight from all the stress of having to raise Izuku by herself. Now that Hisashi was dead, maybe it was Inko to throw herself back into the single life. Inko refocused on her wedding dress and then slammed the closet door shut. She had been forced to raise Izuku by herself. She didn't need anyone else's help. Mom, I'm home, called out an 11-year-old Izuku in a voice Inko barely held. It must have been a hard day at school again. How was your day, sweetie? Inko called out, yet she already knew the answer. Fine, I'm going to work on homework, Izuku said. Inko listened as Izuku climbed the steps and entered his room. As the door closed, Inko let out a breath she didn't realize she had. She had tried to uphold the lying promise that Hisashi had made, to support Izuku's dream of becoming a hero. Yet as a caring mother, Inko didn't want to see Izuku in danger all the time. And with how sideways Izuku's quirk was, Inko had no idea of how to help her son. Inko had seen her once cheerful and optimistic kid turn into a depressed and forgotten kid. Izuku tried to hide it, but Inko could see it in his eyes. The light became dimmer and dimmer every day, and Inko feared that one day it would go out, and then what would become of her son? Would he become a wayless wonder, just making his way through life with no hope for the future? Inko had always wished she could find a way to help her son. In her heart, she prayed that a miracle would bring Izuku some joy, that he would become the Izuku she remembered him by. On the other side, Izuku was doing the same, barely holding on to a small bit of hope that a miracle would happen. As he had gotten closer to finishing elementary, he had decided to take one last shot to see what hope he had in becoming a hero. He had made an account on a hero question and answer forum, made for those heroes that didn't keep a lot of limelight. He had posted his question in the general forum, though he had been vague to hopefully catch the interest of some of the heroes. It worked as Izuku was in direct communication with some heroes who had electric-based quirks. Most of them were able to discharge their quirk and found it weird that Izuku couldn't. Yet as they couldn't be much help for Izuku's direct question, he thanked them for their time and help. Then he focused more on the heroes who had to use equipment with their quirks. While he was happy to have the chance to talk with many types of heroes, all of their conversations ended with them stating that the work and effort that they had to put in to become heroes, most days that effort wasn't worth it. They all stated Izuku had better luck in going into a different profession, one where he could use his quirk differently. Izuku couldn't believe his luck. He wanted to be a hero, a true hero, one that wants to save those around, not for fame or glory or the money, but for the wanting of helping others. To make it so that everyone could live with a smile, just as All Might did. Yet here he was, stuck with a powerful quirk, but unable to use it to achieve his dream. As Izuku pulled up the message with one of the last two heroes he still talked to, Inko looked at him through his nearly closed day. Inko's eyes got watery at seeing how much of a husk her son had become. She had been there for him, even when he forced her away. Yet what could she do? She did not know anything about engineering. She was even a few credits short of getting a degree in business. She had dropped out to marry Hisashi and have Izuku. Inko turned back to the box the woman from the welfare legal firm had forced her to keep. Maybe that could have some answers. Inko made her way back to her room and walked over to her closet. She opened the door, then reached into the back and quietly withdrew the box. She carried it over to the bed, then pulled off the lid. After silently putting the lid on the bed, Inko began to look through the box. The box was filled with some blueprints that Inko couldn't make heads or tails of, so she set them off to the side. Turning her attention back to the box, Inko spotted a large textbook on the bottom. The kind of textbook one would usually see a college student carrying about and making notes in it. Inko pulled the textbook out of the box and set it on the bed. The cover read, An Introduction to Mechanical Engineering, Volume 2. Inko recognized the textbook as it was the one Hisashi had accidentally dropped on her foot when they first bumped into each other at college. Inko chuckled as she remembered how she had swore her lungs out at him, and only stopped when Hisashi offered to take her out for dinner to make for it. The only reason Inko agreed was because his textbook hadn't put her foot into a cast. Now it seemed even years later, Hisashi still hadn't gotten rid of his lucky textbook. Lucky as it had introduced him to her. Inko shook that memory from her focus as she opened the book and saw Hisashi Sataka written in stylized text under the section to whom the book belonged. Moving past that, Inko thumbed through the textbook, recognizing some of the notes she had seen from whenever she helped Hisashi study late into the night. She didn't understand them then and even less now, only enough to make conversation with her ex-husband. As Inko continued to thumb through the book, she wondered if she should give it to Izuku. Hisashi had promised that he would try his best to help Izuku become a hero. Yet as Inko thought about it more and more, she realized how crushing that would be to Izuku. Not only to learn that his father was dead, but that even his brilliant mind and life's work, in the end, had amounted to nothing. That would just tell Izuku how impossible it would be for Izuku to become a hero. So Inko slid the textbook back into the box and put the lid on it, telling herself that Izuku would never see the textbook and it would never see the life of day again. Izuku didn't need to know how much his father had lied to him. Yet it seemed that fate had other plans. At age 13, Izuku had completely removed himself from the social aspect of life. He had no one of being in the spotlight, not that he needed help in any way. Even though he was extremely smart and always had the best test scores, he was brought up to the front of the class to be given praise. Was it because the teacher saw he didn't want it? Or was it because they didn't think he deserved it? Not that it matters, Izuku didn't want it anyway. That just meant by the age of 13 Izuku was a loner in all senses of the word, even going so far as to stop talking to the heroes on the Kandei form. This just gave Izuku more free time to spend at the local beach. The beach might be filled with trash, but it brought Izuku some comfort to surround himself with stuff that was even more useless than him, showing he wasn't at rock bottom yet, but he was close. Izuku had walked to the beach with the intent of wasting another afternoon there, It wasn't like he had anything else better to do. Once Izuku arrived, he walked through the pile of trash that had been swept up by the ocean current and added to by people illegally dumping there. He walked on the sand until he reached his usual pile, which had a broken couch he would lay on. Izuku carefully climbed the pile of trash, already knowing by heart what pieces were loose and what items had good handles. Izuku climbed until he was halfway up and found his broken couch waiting for him. Izuku lowered himself onto the broken couch and looked over the afternoon, almost evening sun. With a sigh, Izuku came back to a thought he had every time he came to the beach. He couldn't believe how far downhill his life had gone. His father had left him. He was a social outcast. His mother looked worse and worse every day, and all because he had a useless quirk. He had tried to power through, work to prove everyone wrong, even God above. But it seemed he wasn't strong enough to make his dreams come true. Damn it, where is it? A voice called down from the ground. Confused as to why anyone else would be at the beach, Izuku stood up and looked around for who was speaking. Yet he couldn't find anyone. Where is that battery? The voice came from Izuku's right, so he turned and looked around. Izuku's eyes fell on a mop of pink dreadlocks, then led to the body of a young girl. Izuku's throat locked up to not allow a scream escape as he hid behind his couch. What was a girl doing at the trash dump? Izuku looked over at his coach and down at the girl. She had pink dreadlocks and was wearing a pair of blue overalls through the straps and around her waist, with a stained black undershirt. Come on, it has to be somewhere around here. I didn't build this baby for nothing, the girl said as she turned around, and Izuku saw a device in her hand. The girl then suddenly looks up at the pile, and Izuku hides behind his couch. Damn it, all this trash is messing with the sensors. I think it's in this direction. The girl turned around, but then stopped. No, it's saying it behind me. The girl smacked the device a few times, but eventually turned back around. She looked up and down the pile again, then kicked it. I don't see anything that looks like a battery. The girl kicked the pile again, and this time the sound of wood breaking occurred as her foot went clean through the backside of a dresser. Well, a hot shower is going to feel nice after all this. The girl withdrew her foot and began walking away, but then stopped when the sound of metal breaking echoed through the beach. Izuku then felt the trash pile begin to shift around his feet. He barely had a chance to curse his life before the trash pile collapsed under him. Izuku landed on a washing machine and dented the side of it, as the rest of the pile fell to the ground around him. Izuku moaned as he picked his head up and looked around, only for his eyes to land on the girl, who was now holding the device in her hands like a weapon. Who are you? The device in the girl's hand beeped, and she looked down at it. She then looked back at Izuku, then back at her device, then back at Izuku, then back at her device, then back at Izuku. And what have you done with my battery? I don't know anything about your battery, Izuku said as he began rubbing the back of his head. He was going to have a bruise there in the morning. I built this baby to pick up on electrical waves, to find me sources to power my new babies. What have you done with my battery? The girl said, though she took a step back. Then she lunged forward and tackled Izuku to the ground. She began stretching him with her nails and beating him with her device. Izuku managed to wrestle the girl off of him and throw sand in her eyes. Izuku quickly got to his feet and took off to get away from the girl before she had another chance to attack. He ran up to the sidewalk and leapt over the guardrail. He briefly stopped to make sure the girl wasn't following him, before running back to his house. Izuku ran down the sidewalks and through the neighborhood, not stopping until she got home. Once inside, Izuku locked the front door. You're home early, Inko called from the kitchen. Are you hungry for dinner? Izuku said nothing as he sat down on the couch, watching the forward door. Inko noticed and asked, Are you waiting for someone? More like watching out for someone, Izuku said, not taking his eyes off the front door. Inko looked at her son, more than a little concerned for his mental health. Maybe she should give him the book and give him something to work forward to. Maybe he could take after her ex-husband, become an engineer, and build something that helped him become a hero, similar to the promise her ex-husband made all those years ago. Inko shook her head. Izuku would just be reminded of all the lies Hisashi had told him. Well, dinner is ready. Maybe you should eat on time for once, Inko said, placing onigiri rice on the table. Izuku reluctantly walked over to the tables, trying his best to keep the front door in view. However, Inko had already sat down, leaving the only chair with its back to the front door. Izuku sighed as he sat down and grabbed some rice. His stomach growled as he ate dinner, his mind soon forgetting the crazy girl from the beach. However, fate enjoys pulling a sick joke on the Midoriya family. 3 hours later, Izuku was watching the TV, a conference talking about the hero's recent activity when a knock came from the door. Izuku lowered the volume on the TV, while his mother got up to answer the door. "Hello, Ms. Midoriya. Sorry to disturb you, but are you familiar with this girl?" A police officer asked at the door. Izuku leaned back a bit and saw that it was the girl from the beach, with the censer still in hand, though her hands were cuffed. The girl noticed him, resulting in her jumping forwards and yelling, "He's got my battery. He's got my battery." After pulling the girl back, the police officer looked further into the apartment and met eyes with Izuku. "Son, can you come to the door for me?" the police officer asked. Izuku sighed as he walked to the front door, trying not to stare at the girl. "This girl here claims you stole a battery from her." Izuku shook his head. He still had no idea why the girl was even looking for a battery. Inko chuckled a bit. "Is that why you're here? I'm sorry if you waste your time." The police officer sighed a bit. "I came because we got a call from your neighbor that this girl was stalking around the apartment, more specifically yours. When asked, she claimed your son stole some kind of battery from her. I'm simply now trying to figure out what's going on." "Officer, I can assure you that my son has stolen nothing in his life," Inko stated. "I understand. However, this is a case of civil dispute, and it would greatly help if you were willing to come down to the station and clear the air. You may also press charges for trespassing." The officer threw a stern look at the girl. However, she didn't seem to notice it as she continued to glare at Izuku. "There's no need for that. We'll come down to the station and help any way we can," Inko said, bowing. It was clear the officer wasn't fully sure how to handle the situation. It's not often something like this happens. The officer bowed slightly, without taking his hand off the girl's shoulder. "Thank you. It will help with the paperwork greatly." Inko returned the bow as she grabbed her purse and car keys. "Izuku, grab your shoes. It looks like we are going on a trip." After a quick ride to the police station, Izuku and Inko were led to a side room where chairs were waiting for them. The opposite wall of the chairs was a one-way window that led to an interrogation room. After a few minutes of waiting, the police officer dragged the pink-haired girl into the room. He walked her over to one of the chairs and then attached the cuffs around her wrist to a chain that was attached to the ground. "Wait here," the police officer said, then disappeared through the door. As Izuku and Inko went back to waiting, Inko turned to Izuku and asked, "Honey, did you steal anything from that girl?" Izuku looked up at his mother and shook his head, showing he was just as confused as to what the girl wanted from him. "She just suddenly appeared at the beach. I think she was looking for some kind of battery. She had some kind of device that pointed itself at me, and then she started to claim that I had stolen a battery from her. I'm surprised she followed me home, all over a non-existent battery." Izuku looked through the one-way window and watched as the girl began pulling stuff from her pockets. Izuku was surprised she had managed to smuggle that much stuff through processing. From everything on the table, the girl began to fiddle with the material, acting as if she was building something. Izuku wasn't sure until a toy helicopter took form. Then the girl pulled an AA battery and inserted it into the helicopter. The blades began to spin and the toy helicopter looked as if it was going to achieve lift, but then the battery must have died as the blades stopped rotating. The girl huffed as she grabbed the helicopter and pulled out the battery. Izuku thought that was the end of that, but then the girl began pulling out more and more batteries, testing each of them, but none of them had enough power to get the helicopter fully into the air. As the girl tested the batteries, Izuku was amazed that the girl had been able to build a seemingly fully functional toy helicopter from scrap. The other issue was it had no power. With that thought, Izuku looked down at his hands. The girl claimed she was looking for a battery. Was it to power the helicopter or to power something else better? Izuku was drawn out of his thoughts as he heard something hit metal. He looked and saw the girl's face planted on the table in front of her, seeming out of frustration of her toy helicopter not being able to work. That confirmed Izuku thought that she had been looking for a power source. Izuku thought of the device the girl had. She claimed it had been built to detect electrical waves. Had it locked onto his quirk and led her to him? Izuku chuckled to himself under his breath and mumbled, "She was looking for a battery and instead found me." A knock came from the door Izuku and Inko had entered through. Then the police officer from before walked in and asked, "Are you comfortable?" "We are, officer. I'm just not sure why you had to put that little girl in an interrogation room," Inko said. She didn't personally know the girl, but seeing the girl in that kind of room made Inko a little nervous. The girl was young and didn't know any better. Well, in the eyes of the law, she is a criminal. She was found stalking and trespassing on private property. So it was either this or a holding cell, and until we get the whole story, it's going to stay like this. The officer seemed a little amused and confused at the situation he was in. He knew when his coworkers heard about this, they would laugh. He always seemed to be the one to get these kinds of cases. "Officer, I think this is simply a matter of misunderstanding each other," Izuku said without taking his eyes off the girl. "She came to the beach looking for a battery, which she would use to power that device she has." The officer looked at the device the girl had discarded and looked a bit panicked as she had it. How she had gotten all that through processing. Hold on, was that the scanner from processing? At the beach, she had a sensor, one that she claimed was built to look for batteries that still had power in them. Her sensor must have picked up on my quirk and directed her to me. She must have thought I got to it first and stolen it. Getting over his concern about what else the girl had broken apart for pieces, the officer looked over the group of discarded batteries on the ground. It would make sense the girl was looking for new batteries if all the ones she had were dead. But why not just go to the local store? The officer looked at Izuku and said, "That's a good working theory." Shoot, it was better than any he had come up with, the best being that the girl was mentally deranged and needed to be admitted to a psych ward. But the best way to figure it out is to talk to her. "Do you mind if I talk to her first?" Izuku asked, still not looking away from the girl. The officer rubbed the back of his head. It was usually protocol that the stalker was not allowed to see their target, yet the girl didn't seem to be dangerous. It's unusual, but she doesn't seem too dangerous. The officer had no idea of what to say, but he knew he wasn't going to send Izuku in. However, Izuku had taken the officer's words as him giving Izuku the okay to go in, so Izuku stood up and walked over to the door that led directly to the interrogation room. He opened the door and walked in. Before Izuku had a chance to close the door, the girl looked over at Izuku and said, "Thief." The girl glared at Izuku, but he was used to getting death glares from Kaken, so hers did nothing to Izuku as he calmly closed the door. He then turned and walked to the table and sat across from the girl. He looked her in the eyes and said, "I am not a thief. My name is Izuku Midoriya." The girl instinctively introduced herself as Mei Hatsum. "If you're not a thief, then where's my battery? Where did you hide it?" "Funny thing, there was never a battery. Did you manage to sneak in that sensor of yours?" Izuku asked, as it would be useful in explaining his point. Hatsum nodded as she reached into her overall pockets and pulled out the sensor. Izuku could only imagine the officer's reaction to how Hatsum had managed to sneak that in. Izuku gestured for the sensor, so Hatsum put it on the table and slid it across. Izuku then grabbed the sensor and looked it over. There were several buttons and dials on it. Luckily, Izuku found one that was labeled power. The screen turned on and Izuku saw several options. Not wanting to mess with anything, he selected the option that said, "Continue the previous session." The screen flashed green and 2 beeps went off. Then after a few seconds, a black arrow appeared and spun around. Around 10 seconds, the arrow turned green and pointed itself directly at Izuku. Izuku then slid the sensor back to Hatsum to look at. She looked at the arrow and saw it was still directly pointed at Izuku. "You have my battery on you. Give it to me." Hatsum tried to lunge at Izuku again, but was stopped as the chains attached to her cuffs stopped her. Hatsum lost her balance and nearly biffed her chin on the table. "I told you there was no battery. You device things were picking up my quirks. It was reading the bioelectricity within my body," Izuku said. "Prove it." "Prove then my baby was reading your quirk," Hatsum said. Izuku said as he thought of a way to show off his quirk. His phone was completely charged, and there was no specialized multimeter able to read his quirk. Izuku's attention then fell on the toy helicopter. He reached forwards and grabbed it. He then inserted his left pinky into the battery slot as far as it would go. The next second, the helicopter blades began to quickly pick up speed, making the motor hum loudly. until the blades were going too fast and broke away from the helicopter, making Izuku and Hatsum duck from the sudden flying knives. As Izuku sat back up, he saw that Hatsum had a massive grin and stars in her eyes. "You're perfect. With you, I won't have to worry about ever running out of power for my babies again. I never thought I would see that quirk that would be able to power my babies." Hatsum launched herself again at Izuku, but this time she looked to be grabbing him instead of trying to hit him. Izuku quickly stood up from his chair, knocking it over as he stepped back. The door that led to the side room flew open and the officer stopped in with Inko behind him. "Midoriya, I think that's enough. Hatsum, your parents are here to pick you up." The officer then walked over to Hatsum and unchained her cuffs. He then put a hand on her shoulder and directed her out of the room. Izuku and Inko walked them to the front room of the station. Two people with similar characteristics to Hatsum were waiting in the lounge. The moment they spotted Hatsum, they stood up. "Mom, Dad, I finally found something powerful enough to power my babies," Hatsum said, hopping over to her parents. Her father was wearing a similar outfit to her, but had fewer grease stains over his overalls. Mrs. Hatsum looked more presentable, with a simple pair of jeans and a dark blue short-sleeved shirt. She obviously recently washed her hair, as it was done up in a ponytail, while her husband's hair was full of dirt and hung loose around his neck. What is she referring to?" Inko asked, turning Hatsum's attention to her. Hearing Mei referring to something as babies was a little concerning for Inko. Mei was only Izuku's age, so she shouldn't have kids of her own. "Oh, sorry. That's what our little ball of energy refers to her invention as. Sorry if she caused you any issue," Mrs. Hatsum asked, placing a hand on Mei's shoulder. It was a habit that Mei had picked up from her father before his wife made him break it. Inko took a deep breath as she felt her worry begin to disappear. She hadn't made plans to press charges. If anything, with Mei stalking Izuku, Inko might be able to use that to scare Izuku out of his solitary life. Everything is fine. It was just a simple matter of misunderstanding. In the end, no real harm was done. "So what did you find, my little girl?" Mr. Hatsum asked, wrestling a hug out of his daughter. Mei tried to wiggle out of it, but failed. Mei admitted defeat and suddenly pointed at Izuku with only her right hand, leaving her left hand by her side, revealing that only her left hand was still in cuffs. With greed in her eyes and voice, Mei simply said, "Him." Hi," Izuku asked, giving a small wave. He didn't like being around new people and being the center of attention, so the two adults looking at him were quite unnerving, especially when they were the parents of his new stalker. Mr. Satsum looked over Izuku, then threw a confused glance at his daughter. "Him? What do you mean?" "His quirk," Mei said, though that cause made her parents even more confused, leading them both to look to Izuku for an explanation of what their daughter could possibly be talking about. "My quirk, static cell, allows my blood cells to generate a high amount of bioelectricity, turning me into a living battery," Izuku said, reminding himself he needed to come up with a better way to explain his quirk. That explains that. My little ball of energy is always making new projects, big projects, and they all require a high amount of electricity to run. Store-bought batteries just don't cut it. So she found you and thought she had to do whatever she could to use you." Mr. Hatsum laughed at his comment, while Mrs. Hatsum and Inko blushed. "How about dinner tomorrow on us, to make up for the trouble our daughter has caused you?" Mrs. Hatsum offered, holding her hand out towards Inko. "There's no need for that. As I said, no harm was done," Inko said, shaking her head. "Then let's just say it's more to ease our consciousness," Mrs. Hatsum offered, but Inko shook her head again. "Then how about a new friendship, despite its strange beginning? My daughter knows about your son and his quirk. She's going to be looking for him again and again." That made Inko chuckle a bit as she thought about the offer. In the end, she accepted it with a handshake. Then, as Mr. Hatsum led his daughter out to the car, Mrs. Hatsum handled the paperwork and finalized dinner plans with Inko. When all was settled, the family parted ways until tomorrow evening. Inko and Izuku drove to a grocery store where they found the Hatsums waiting for them. Across the street was an expensive Japanese barbecue restaurant that Mr. Hatsum led the group to. Upon entering, they were immediately led to a table and given time to look over the menus. Inko looked over her menu and noticed how high the prices were. Inko expressed her worry about not wanting to take advantage of Hatsum's generosity, but Mr. Hatsum said she didn't need to worry. We can handle any kind of bill. You see, our family business is making support equipment for pro heroes. It allows us to live a small bit of luxury, but nothing too major. Mr. Hatsum explained, and Izuku's eyes went wide. What heroes do you make equipment for? Izuku asked as his eyes turned into stars. Mostly the local heroes, Airjet and his kind, or up-and-coming pro heroes that can't afford the bills from the more expensive support companies. Mr. Hatsum said with a chuckle. As he continued to answer Izuku's question, Mrs. Hatsum leaned over to Inko and said, "You've got a little fanboy there." It's been his dream to be a dream since he got his quirk. He looks up to them, more than the other kids. But with his quirk, he can't discharge any of his electricity like others can, so becoming a hero became less and less likely to happen. He would need some powerful equipment to use his quirk properly. Just look at his phone. He had to modify it, and its battery can withstand being charged by his quirk. Inko explained. Izuku is into engineering? Mrs. Hatsum asked. Inko shocked her head, not heavily. He likes to take things apart and put them back together, but others seriously pass that. When he worked on his phone, he had some help from a gentleman in our neighborhood who did work as an engineer for the city. Oh, still the kid has all that electricity and no way to use it. Mrs. Hatsum said, then seemed to get lost in thought for a few seconds. She then looked at Izuku and then back at Inko. Would you say Izuku still wants to become a hero? He hasn't talked about it for years, but yes, I think he wants more than anything to become a hero. Inko said. Then how would he be up for receiving some help from a local hero support company? Mrs. Hatsum asked. What do you have in mind? Inko asked, noticing a cheeky smirk on Mrs. Hatsum. A similar smile that her ex-husband always got when he had an idea that could either make him millions or blow right up in his face. Inko smiled a bit at that, but quickly shook her mind away from her ex-husband and refocused on Mrs. Hatsum. I know our families might have gotten off on an awkward foot, and I know you think this dinner makes up for it. However, I have an idea, one I would like to run by your son and see what he thinks of it. If he could come by the shop after school on Monday, I believe we would have something that would excite him. Mrs. Hatsum had already pulled out a business card. She put it on the table and slid it in front of Inko before tapping it twice. Inko looked over the business as she thought over Mrs. Hatsum's offer. It read Hatsum Industries, helping those that help others. Inko couldn't deny they had met in a bizarre way. However, the Hatsums seemed like genuinely good people. If they thought they could help Izuku, Inko would accept it. More so if they could help her with her idea of helping her son. I'll ask Izuku about it and see what he thinks. Inko accepted the business card, and Mrs. Hatsum nodded and made no other comment about the situation for the rest of the night. The group enjoyed the rest of their dinner, afterwards departing. Inko did bring up Mrs. Hatsum's offer for the entire drive. Inko didn't bring it up until Izuku was ready for bed and already over his cover. She then knocked on his door and said, "Hey Zuzu, can I talk to you for a few seconds?" Confused about what his mother wanted to talk about, Izuku walked over and opened the door. "Yeah, Mom. What do you want to talk about?" Izuku asked as he looked down at his mom. She had a thoughtful look on her face, one that she only had in passing and one she thought Izuku never noticed before. Inko walked into the room and sat down on Izuku's bed, gesturing for him to join her. Once Izuku sat down, she continued, "I know this past few years have been hard, with your father not being home and stopping with the phone calls. And I know you still want to be a hero." Izuku was about to say something, but Inko stopped him. "We don't talk about your dream much anymore, but I know you still have. And I'm sorry that I haven't been able to help in any way, but..." Inko took a deep breath. "But during dinner, Mrs. Hatsum gave me an offer. She said that their company might have something that could help you with your quirk, something that could help you become a hero." Inko pulled the business card from her pocket and held it out to Izuku. Izuku took the card and looked it over. He hadn't fully given up on his dream of becoming a hero, but he came to terms that he never could. The Hatsum seemed like nice people, maybe a little weird, but they helped new pro heroes. So if they thought they could help Izuku, he should take the offer. But what if in the end, they couldn't help? That would just reaffirm just how impossible it was for Izuku to become a hero. Would he lose the last bit of hope he had? Was it worth taking that chance? Then again, if anyone could help Izuku, it seemed that the Hatsum were the best option. They helped all different kinds of heroes and would be best suited for helping Izuku. Izuku recalled something his father used to say: "It's better to try and live with the experience than always question what could have happened." With that thought, Izuku nodded his head. He would ask the Hatsum for help, and if in the end they couldn't, Izuku would just work twice as hard to keep his hopes up, that he would eventually find a way to become a hero. He would keep his dream until lock and key, knowing he would never be able to live with himself if he stopped trying. Izuku focused back on the business card before taking a deep breath and saying, "It can't hurt to see what they have." Inko nodded and stood up from the bed, showing the first genuine smile she had towards her son in years. Being about to hear the optimistic kid was still in him. He was still hoping out hope that he could be the best he could be. Inko took the business card and said, "I'll give them a call in the morning." Monday could not have gone any faster. From the moment Izuku woke up, he was counting the seconds until school was out. He had a small smile as he headed downstairs for breakfast, something that Inko didn't point out but was more than happy to see. Once breakfast was over, Izuku headed to school with a small hop in his step. He was more attentive in class than he had ever been, something that pissed Bakugo off to no end. But Izuku was so happy that even when Bakugo tried to get to him during lunch, Izuku never truly lost his smile. It just became more hidden. As soon as the final bell rang, Izuku quickly shoved all his stuff into his backpack, and he was out the door as he heard Kago yell, "Deku, get the F432K back here." Izuku had no plan of stopping as his walk increased into a slow jog. He had had a good weekend for once and possibly an even better evening coming up. He wasn't going to give Bakugo a chance to ruin that for him. To make sure that didn't happen, Izuku picked up the pace and was soon out in front of the school. He quickly spotted the family car and ran over to it. He slipped in the front side and Inko chuckled and asked, "Did you have a good day?" "Yes," Izuku said with a nod. Finally, the waiting he had been doing all day was nearly at an end. He was finally able to see if he would be able to become a hero. Inko nodded and drove away from the school. Following the directions on her phone, Inko drove the car to the downtown part of Mizutofu until she was directed into a parking lot. After finding a spot to park, the mother and son got out of the car and went to the building. There was a large sign on the side of the building that spelt Hatsumi Industries with an LED glow behind it. Before fully closing her door, Inko reached in and grabbed a textbook from under her seat. No matter how the day went, Inko knew she needed to give the textbook to Izuku. They walked across the parking lot and headed inside. The front lobby was small with only 2 couches and 4 chairs and a mounted waterfall off to the side. At the end of the lobby, a large desk with a red-head woman sitting behind it. Inko and Izuku walked up to the desk and the woman asked, "Did you have an appointment?" I believe the name would be under Midoriya. They said to arrive whenever possible," Izuku said, unsure of what to say as no real plan had been made. So she was unsure if an official appointment had been made. "The special guests. If you could take the elevator to floor 6, you'll find Mr. and Mrs. Hatsumi waiting for you," the receptionist said, gesturing to the elevator that was to her right. Inko and Izuku thanked the woman and then walked over to the elevator. After calling it down and riding it up to floor 6, the elevator dinged and the doors opened. Upon fully opening, Mr. Hatsum was revealed to be working with a pro hero, while Mrs. Hatsum was standing off to the side by a table with a tablet in hand. As Inko and Izuku walked out of the elevator, Mr. Hatsumi noticed them and said, "The Midoriyas. Glad you could come." The hero scoffed, and Mr. Hatsum turned his attention back to him. "Oh, I'm sorry, Crimson Dynamo. We weren't expecting them so soon. Traffic must have been light." Crimson Dynamo huffed and looked at Izuku. "He's your special guest." Crimson Dynamo was a tall and muscular man. As he stood up, he was easily comparable to All Might, but not as big. So to him, Izuku looked like a little twig that would snap under his foot. "More like our daughters," Mrs. Hatsumi stated, writing something on the tablet and then turning it off. She looked a little flustered but quickly hid that with a smile as she put the tablet on the table. "Whatever, just make sure you fix my equipment as soon as possible." Crimson Dynamo stood up and walked to the elevator. He had to lean a bit to fit, then quickly closed the doors. The mother and son looked back at Hatsum's. He has a rough personality, but he's a good man at heart. Mr. Hatsumi waved off their concerned looks, got into a fight with some thugs, and they managed to bust some of his armor. Mr. Hashum then dropped the piece of armor in his hand onto the table. More important is helping you out, young Midoriya. Mr. Hastumi pulled out his own tablet and turned it on. I used some connections to get a hold of your Quirk file. Perks of being in the hero business. Mr. Hatsum cleared his throat and then began reading Izuku's files. Izuku Midoriya, Quirk, hyperstatic cell. His body processes the ability to generate a high amount of static bioelectricity. When first tested, his body was able to produce 105 volts of pure electricity. However, after further testing, it was found that he was unable to discharge, unlike many other electricity-based quirks. Like other electricity-based quirks, this number is expected to rise. However, as his primary reading was higher than the average, doctors were unable to predict how much Izuku's quirk would grow. Even mentioned that it would be hard to get a proper read, as Izuku Midoriya's quirk does not work with standard equipment. The rest goes more into the depths of the science of how your body generates its bioelectricity, but we won't worry about that. We'll worry about the last line. The file stated devices struggle to withdraw the electricity from your body, as my mother told my wife that you have to modify your phone to siphon off your quirk. Izuku nodded, and Mr. Hatsum smiled. I think we have a workaround. You see, a problem with early technology was that there was no way to limit how voltage went in. If you put a 5-volt light bulb into a 10-volt socket, you're going to overload the bulb and cause it to break. Your quirk has a safety feature similar to those lines of thinking. It can sense that if it pushed too hard, it would break the bulb out. So a solution is to use a piece of equipment that can handle your quirks of electricity, while also being able to dampen its output so as not to overload other equipment. Mr. Hastumi crouched out and grabbed a briefcase that was leaning against the table. He set it on the table and opened it. He pulled out a device that looked like a high-tech hockey puck, just bigger, and set it on the table. Izuku looked the device over and saw that it was silver and one of the flat faces was glass. This is a device my wife and I created to help lightning-based quirk users. However, with the palladium core we used, the thing was so powerful that it was too efficient. Imagine that. The cost was not worth it, so we mass-produced a weaker version of it. That all worked just fine. But with the amount of bioelectricity you theorized to be able to produce, the palladium core might actually work. I believe this is the solution to your problem, young Midoriya. Mr. Hastumi walked over and handed the device to Izuku. Sorry to say, but this particular device connects to your chest. You'll have to be shirtless for this bit. Izuku looked at the device, wondering whether it was worth it to go shirtless. Not letting his mind overthink it, he slipped off his shirt and held the device against his chest. The metal was cold against his chest. Luckily, it quickly warmed up as it adhered to his bare chest. The arc reactor flickered for a bit, then gave off a steady blue light as Izuku felt his quirk starting to siphon into the device. Moving past that feeling, Izuku looked down and saw he was as scrawny as ever. He barely had any kind of muscle on his body, causing him to feel a little self-conscious now about being shirtless. The elevator dinged, and a few seconds later, Mei Hatsumi walked in. Hey Dad. Hey Mom. Ms. Potts said Midoriya and his mom were here. Mei Hatsumi's eyes flew on Izuku, more specifically the device on his chest. Ah, you already gave him the arc reactor. I want to be the one to give it to him. Sorry, baby girl, you were too slow to get home, but we're just about to test it out, Mrs. Hatsumi said. She pulled out a device, which Izuku recognized as a multimeter, a heavily modified multimeter. She walked over and attached the 2 clips to the base and top of the arc reactor. She turned on the device and said, just breathe normally, relax, and let your quirk flow. Izuku nodded as he took a deep breath and relaxed the best he could. Mrs. Hatsum tapped a few buttons and then waited for it to get a reading. Once the reading appeared, she let out a small squeak. She quickly pressed a few buttons and got the same reading. This caused her to slowly turn the device to her father and let him look at the screen. Mr. Hatsumi walked over and took the device. He tapped the screen a few times, but something was causing him to be confused. Young Midoriya, when you first got your quirk, you were able to produce 105 volts, though the doctors said it might be higher since your quirk didn't work with standard equipment. Right. Yes, Izuku recalled his first test. Well, this is reading 300 million volts. That's nearly 3 gigajoules. That could easily power something big for 15 minutes, Mr. Hatsumi said, showing Izuku the device. There was a lot of information that Izuku didn't understand, but his eyes were drawn to the reading of 300 million volts. Guess it's a good thing you can't accidentally discharge. You could easily kill a bunch of people. Mrs. Hatsumi quickly smacks her husband on the back of the head. Don't scare the kid. Can I have him finally try some of my babies? May asked, grabbing a briefcase off the table. She ran over and began to open it, without even much as an answer. Izuku looked down and saw that she was pulling out some kind of boot. Only if young Midoriya is up for it, Mrs. Hatsumi asked. She was the only social one of the trio and could understand Izuku's hesitation. They had just met and really didn't know each other. Izuku nodded. Over the weekend, he had researched some of the heroes Mr. Hatsumi had listed during dinner. Seeing the different equipment those heroes used made Izuku curious about what the family had made. And if he was the only one that could power them, he would happily help them. It could be his first step towards becoming a hero. May dragged Izuku over to the side of the room and began having him try out the different inventions. Using the arc reactor to power different devices also gave Mrs. Hatsumi the chance to get some data on how Izuku's quirk reacted to the arc reactor. While that went on, the three parents sat down. Inko had a large textbook on her lap, and Mr. Hatsumi noticed, "Where did you get that?" "It's from my ex-husband. He went to college for mechanical engineering. I thought about having Izuku go that career path because he would have a chance to find a way to use his quirk. But it appears you solved that issue," Inko said as she put the textbook on the table. "Ex-husband?" Mr. Hatsumi asked, dodging a punch from his wife. "We divorced when Izuku was 6. He died a few years later, but Izuku still thinks he is working overseas. We're going to be running out of savings soon, and I'll start looking for a job. This textbook and a box full of blueprints are the only things I have left right now," Inko said, looking down at the textbook and thinking of the box that was still hidden in her closet. Her thoughts then drifted to the will, but she still refused to sign that, believing she didn't need help from her ex-husband. Yet maybe she should have a look at the will and see what exactly Hisashi had left her. Well, young Midoriya could still go into mechanical engineering. We would be willing to teach him. He'll probably spend some time here, dragged here by our daughter, and we'll be happy to teach him. It will give him a chance to learn more about his quirk," Mrs. Hatsumi offered, looking at the starry-eye look on Izuku's face as he was slightly lifted off the ground. Inko looked over at her son, as he seemed to be hovering with some kind of boots and failing to keep his balance. "I think he would appreciate that very much. I would give him something to look towards." Mr. and Mrs. Hatsumi bowed slightly. Over the coming weeks, Izuku came over to Hatsum Industries after school and would help May test whatever new and improved invention she had. Then during the weekends, he was taught engineering by Mrs. and Mr. Hatsum. It was slow at the beginning, but then knowledge seemed to take hold and Izuku was quickly moving through the textbooks. He was quickly catching up to May's level of engineering, making it seem he had been studying since a young age. As Izuku's proficiency grew, the Hatsums would throw him a bone in the form of designing a new piece of equipment for a pro hero or repairing damaged equipment. As Izuku became more and more comfortable and confident in working on hero equipment, Mr. Hatsum purposely offered Izuku a job and made him a part-time employee of Hatsum Industries. Izuku was slow to accept the offer, though after being encouraged by Inko, he accepted the job. Inko encouraged Izuku to accept the job, as their savings were starting to show empty, and while Inko had submitted resumes to different jobs, she had only gotten a few calls back. Through all he had learned and getting a new job, Izuku's dream of becoming a hero just grew and grew. To better prepare for becoming a hero and to help work on invention, Izuku began to train. Not in any form of combat, but he bought himself a pair of weights and began running into the evening. When Izuku hit 12, he worked on the courage to ask the hero who came for repairs if they would spar with him. It took a bit, but as soon as the first hero agreed to it, Izuku was sparring against pro heroes right and left. In the beginning, Izuku spent most of his time on the mat, but slowly he started to gain some skill and he got tips from the hero on what to practice to become better. He mainly trained with Crimson Dynamo, Whiplash, and Captain Japan, as they were three that were always coming in for repairs. but he trained with any hero he could, especially when a special guest arrived. It was on a Friday evening. Izuku and Mei were in the room where heroes came to bring in their damaged equipment. They were working on their homework when the elevator dinged. Without looking up, Izuku said in autopilot, "Welcome to Hatsum Industries. If you would fill out the form on the counter, your hero name, the type of equipment that needs to be repaired, and if this is your first thing coming to Hatsum Industries, please also provide your usual support company." The sound of dense metal landing on the counter made Izuku look up. His eyes went wide as he recognized the pro hero. "What the hell are two middle schoolers doing here?" Mirko said as she looked Izuku in the eyes. "Sorry, Mirko," Izuku said as he stood up. He looked down at the equipment that had been placed on the counter. It was Mirko's boot, and they looked like they had been blown to pieces, which should have been impossible as they were made out of dense titanium. "I asked, what are two middle schoolers doing here?" Mirko asked. She had been recommended to Hatsum Industries as the local go-to place to get her boots fixed, as they worked faster and were reliable for a good price. But if they had middle schoolers. "This is Mei Hatsum. Her parents own the business, and I'm here doing a bit of an internship to get prepared for going to UA," Izuku said. Mirko looked Izuku up and down, then grinned. "A little runt like you think they can get into UA?" Before Izuku could say anything, Mei scoffed and said, "He's held his own against a few pro heroes. Crimson Dynamo and Whiplash, to name a few. Sorry, kiddos, but there is a difference between pro heroes like those meatheads and me," Mirko said, as she crossed her arms and began tapping her foot. Mei looked up and Izuku shrugged his shoulders. Mirko is working her way to being in the top 20. That made Mirko smile. Izuku smiled back and then went back to the equipment. "So, Ms. Mirko, what caused your equipment to get to this state?" "Was chasing out a villain with a speed quirk. He kept throwing stuff at me and wore my boots down. He managed to get away, but I'm going to track him down. I want to be at my best when I find him," Mirko said. "Well, with that, we'll mark your equipment down as top priority. With how damaged your equipment is, we'll see what we can recover and what we can repair. But from the look of it, your support company will have to build you a whole new set." "I don't have a support company," Mirko said. Izuku tilted his head to show his confusion. "Oh, every pro hero has a company that built their equipment. Then may I ask where you originally got these?" "Costume order. From what company gives me the best deals? Right now you are the most convinced, and others said you would give me a good price," Mirko said. "Well, that makes things easier and more complicated," Izuku said, trying to pick up one of the boots and having a look at them. Yet the boot was so heavy, Izuku couldn't understand how Mirko could fight in them. "Do you perhaps have the blueprint on you?" "On my laptop back at my apartment," Mirko said. "If you could send those in, we could have your equipment ready to go by Sunday," Izuku said, then pulled out a business from his wallet. "Just email the file to the email on the card, and we'll begin working away on them." Mirko took the card and looked it over. "Fine." She then turned and walked back to the elevator. As soon as the door closed behind Mirko, Izuku collapsed into his chair. Keeping his cool around a top 30 pro hero took more out of Izuku than he thought. Mei looked over at Izuku and said, "You're not getting any sleep tonight, are you?" "Depends on when Mirko sends the files," Izuku said. With that, he went back to his homework and Mei joined him. They continued to work on their homework until it was time to head home. Yet before leaving, Izuku checked his work email and saw that Mirko had sent the files less than an hour after leaving Hatsum Industries. Mei looked over Izuku's shoulders as he opened the blueprints. They both began to analyze the blueprints to show what could be improved. Mei then walked over to the clock and clocked off, while Izuku closed his laptop and promptly turned and walked back to the elevator. Mei just shook her head as Izuku was not going to get paid for overtime, not that he cared. No matter how often Izuku had a chance to work on a hero's equipment, he was also starstruck, meaning he was going to spend the night at Hatsum Industries working on Mirko equipment, and he did so all of Saturday. Saturday evening, Izuku sent Mirko an email that her equipment was readying to be picked up Sunday morning. Sunday morning, Mirko woke up in her temporary apartment and quickly changed into her hero costume. She then angrily packed all of her stuff as she hadn't been able to find that villain that broke her equipment, and she was being called to a different city to help with the problem. She then dropped off all of her suitcases at the train station and then made her way to Hatsum Industries, where she was directed to the 6th floor. Upon arriving on the 6th floor, Mirko was greeted with an empty white room, save for a gray table with a metal chest on it, and Izuku working a punching bag not too far away from the table. He was wearing a white sleeveless shirt and a pair of black Zuko pants. Mirko watched Izuku work on the punching bag as she walked up to him, noticing he had some tone to his arm, something she hadn't noticed under Izuku's baggy jacket. When Mirko was only a few feet away, she cleared her throat. That caught Izuku's attention, so he grabbed the bag with his gloved hands, stopping it. Then he pulled out his headphones, letting them hang around his neck by the cord that connected them. He then turned around and noticed Mirko. "Oh, Mirko." Izuku seemed to squeak, but then he cleared his throat. "Sorry, I wasn't accepting you so soon." "It's 9:38, Mirko said. Izuku tilted his head as he pulled out his phone and saw it was 9:38. "Oh, guess I lost track of time. Your equipment is in the chest," Izuku said as he gestured to the chest. He and Mirko walked over to the chest, where Izuku grabbed a small towel and a water bottle. "Thanks for sending in the blueprints. It helped speed up the process." Izuku then gestured to Mirko to open the metal chest. Mirko undid the 2 latches and then pulled open the lid. Inside, laying a purple pillow, were Mirko's new boots. What's with the showmanship? Mr. and Mrs. Hatsum started that, with the belief that each new piece of equipment deserves a show of respect. "I do it because it's tradition," Izuku said as he whipped his brow with the towel and downed some water. "Try them on." Mirko pulled out her new boots and slipped them onto her feet. She immediately noticed some changes. "You changed them." Izuku flinched and said, "Sorry, I noticed that your boots were more designed for function rather than comfort. Which I don't understand since you're running around in them all day. I'm close to calling it torture what your old boots did to your feet. So I reworked them a bit to provide some more comfort." Izuku then took a breath to stop himself. Mirko hopped up and down in place, and every time she landed she noticed her feet weren't feeling as much impact. "Nice." "I also added some bracers inside, not only to add some extra power, but to help redistribute any force your boots get from blocking attacks," Izuku said, then turned and gestured to his punching bag. "Would you like to give them a try?" Mirko nodded. Everything seemed fine, but she wasn't going to go into battle with equipment she didn't trust. She walked over to the punching bag and kicked it. She barely felt anything despite the fact she knew she had put some power behind that kick. Mirko then winded up her strongest kick and launched it at the punching bag. The chain holding the bag up immediately broke and the bag was sent flying, while Mirko only felt some of the impact. "Great, now I have to pay for a new one," Izuku grumbled, but then put on a smile. "So what do you think?" "Damn runt. Now I understand why the heroes I talk to won't stop singing your praise. They won't shut up about how well Hatsum Industries did support equipment," Mirko said as she began hopping up and down again. "The boot felt perfect." "Thanks," Izuku said as he began to rub the back of his neck. "You said you want to get into UA support department, I assume," Mirko said. "Hero course actually. I'm here at Hatsum Industries to gain the skills to build the equipment that is going to help me get in," Izuku said. "Oh," Mirko said. "I know there is a bad stigma around pro heroes that rely too much on support equipment, but hey, at least I'm trying," Izuku said. Every time he told a new pro hero he trained with that he wanted to become a hero, they gave him words of encouragement, but when he mentioned how he had to rely on equipment so much, they backed off a bit. "Well, damn, if you can build equipment as good as these, I'm curious to see what you have in mind for yourself," Mirko said as she looked over her boots. Noticed how polished the metal was. She almost wasn't looking forward to when they lost their shine. "Nothing at the moment," Izuku said, then cleared his throat. "Ms. Mirko, I was wondering. To help prepare to become a hero, I sometimes spar with other pro heroes whenever they come in to get their equipment fix. I was wondering if I could have the chance to spar with you." Mirko bent over laughing, while Izuku stood there waiting. He was used to being laughed at by other kids his age. "Sorry, kid, but teaching like that isn't my style. I keep my lone rabbit style close to my chest." "Oh, you don't have to teach me anything. It's just a spar to see how I handle myself against you. Like you said, there is a good difference between you and other pro heroes," Izuku said with a smile. Mirko thought about it for a second. "If you fight me, The service fee will be free. Izuku added. All right, kid. You sold me. Sounds like how you see people. I don't have to be at the train station until the evening. You have until either that or when you tap out. Whatever comes first, and don't think I won't hold back because you're a kid. Mirko said. I would be disappointed if you did, Izuku said, as he tightened his glove and got into his natural fighting stance. Mirko laughed at that and launched her leg at Izuku. She was surprised when Izuku expertly took a step back and stopped just outside of Mirko's range. Mirko's foot surprisingly hit the ground first, and she looked at Izuku. Izuku had a small smirk, one that Mirko was more than happy to try and knock off. So with a small yell, Mirko launched herself and unleashed a barrage of kicks at Izuku. As Izuku managed to dodge Mirko's attack, she noticed green lightning was jumping across Izuku's eyes. So that's how the hell you're able to dodge, Mirko said. Then did a feint on her right, and when Izuku moved to dodge Mirko's left leg, Mirko turned the feint into an actual attack. Mirko's foot connected with Izuku's chest, and he was sent rolling across the floor. Mirko was confused as Izuku should have been able to tell the feint was just a delayed attack. Why the hell didn't you dodge? You were reading my mind. What? Izuku said, then coughed a bit. I wasn't reading your mind. No, my quirk is electricity-based, but I can't discharge it, so I learned to use it in other ways. One I recently figured out was how to direct my quirk to mind and accelerate my thinking. Allows me to follow my opponent's movements better. Izuku then got back up to his feet, and as he walked back to Mirko, he rolled his shoulder. I didn't tap out. Mirko nodded as Izuku got back to his fighting stance. Mirko went easy on Izuku, afraid to hurt him, but Izuku had made it clear he wasn't afraid to get hit. So Mirko kicked forward and Izuku easily dodged. Mirko huffed as she kicked her other leg, but again Izuku easily dodged as more green lighting jumped across his eyes. So Izuku could follow her movement, but he wasn't predicting, so he could still get tricked. So Mirko backhanded him with her raised foot and sent him bouncing against the ground. Mirko was sure Izuku would tap out from that one hit, as she had put quite a bit of force behind it. Yet to her surprise, Izuku got to his knees and then to his feet. I know how to take a hit. I've got an old childhood friend whose quirk hits harder than that. And I thought you said you weren't going to hold back. I've seen videos of your fights. You can hit harder than that. Mirko looked Izuku up and down. He wasn't the same scared nerd she had first met. It seemed getting into a fight had gotten him into a zone, something that Mirko knew all too well. She smirked and said, if that's how you want it. Mirko then launched herself at Izuku, moving faster as Izuku's resilience was making her feel fired up. They continued to spar into the afternoon, and to Mirko's surprise, every time Izuku got hit, he was quick to get back on his feet. Until around 2 o'clock, after Mirko kicked Izuku's cross out of the way, her foot connected with Izuku's chest and launched him into the wall. He hit the wall and slid down to the ground. He then tapped his shoulder and took a deep breath. Mirko walked over to Izuku and held out her hand. Damn, Runt, I don't think I've ever met a middle schooler as stubborn as you. You just getting up, even after I hit you hard. You've earned my respect, Runt. Izuku smiled, then chuckled as he took Mirko's hand and hauled him to his feet. Enough respect to get your autograph. Izuku then magically pulled out his journal and held it out in front of him. Please. I like to get the autograph of every pro hero I meet, and especially those I get to spar again. Fine, you Runt, Mirko said, as she took the journal and gave out one of the first few autographs she ever had in her years of being a pro hero. Mirko then tossed the journal back to Izuku, whose smile could light up the work. Izuku put the journals back and then brought out a flash drive from his pocket. Here, the blueprint for your new boots. So you can get them from whatever company you order them from next, Izuku said. Mirko looked down at the flash drive and said, keep it. Mirko then turned from Izuku and walked to the elevator and called it up. As she stepped into the elevator, she turned and looked at Izuku. I'll be calling you up when I need a new pair. Izuku smiled as the elevator closed, and he slipped the flash drive back into his pocket. He then took a step towards the table to put the metal chest away, and his entire body screamed. Okay, maybe I'll leave that for tomorrow, Izuku said, then checked the time. He needed to get home and rest and relax for school. So leaving the metal chest on the table, Izuku headed home. As Izuku took a bus home, He dropped the harder person he created to get Mirko to agree to the fight. Now he couldn't help but smile. Once he got home, he took a hot bath, and after dinner, Izuku went to bed. Despite how much Izuku changed working at Hatsum Industries, at school he stuck with his socially awkward self. He continued not to talk to anyone, was always working on homework, and never drew attention to himself. Yet unknown to Izuku, people had begun to notice the change in Izuku. They noticed Izuku had begun to hold his head up a bit more, speak with a bit more confidence when he answered a question in class. Izuku even began to smile a bit throughout the day. They also noticed the change in Izuku's physique, as through his training at Hatsumi Industries, Izuku had begun to put some weight on. In the form of defining muscles, it began to make Izuku look like a bodybuilder. From some angles, they noticed that Izuku's chest gave off a little blue glow. However, it was hard to notice through Izuku's shirt, and it was impossible to see if he had a jacket zipped up. And out of everyone, Bakugo noticed the most. And it pissed him off. Bakugo hated the new Deku, the Deku who was supposed to be a wreck nerd with a useless quirk. At first, he just thought he was seeing things, his mind playing tricks on him. However, as he watched Deku, he saw his suspicion be confirmed. Something had changed with the nerd, and Bakugo decided that he needed to find what was causing Deku to be such a pain in the ass. One day after school, Bakugo noticed Deku was no longer heading in the direction of his home after school. That was clear from the start, as their houses were in neighborhoods right next to each other. And as Bakugo went east, Deku would immediately turn and head west. Bakugo had asked the old hag if Aunt Inko had moved, but she hadn't heard anything. That just pissed Bakugo off, as Deku was going somewhere new. And whatever that place was, it was responsible for the change in the nerd's behavior. When Bakugo finally had enough, he decided to follow Deku. It was the Friday following Izuku's fight with Mirko, and Bakugo kept a close watch on Deku during the last period. As per usual, the nerd was quick to gather his things and leave the school building. Bakugo quickly gathered his material and walked out of the classroom. After telling two of his lackeys to get lost, Bakugo hurried to the front of the school. He immediately spotted Deku and began to follow him, while keeping his distance from Deku, so the nerd didn't know he was being followed. Bakugo followed Deku as he left the residential area and walked through the commercial area. Bakugo almost lost Deku as they entered the business area of town, but managed to find the big fluff of green hair. While doing this, Bakugo's anger was rising the entire time. Not only was Deku training, but he was also training in secret and was willing to travel so far every day to do so. That could only mean one thing. Deku had finally grown a pair and was training to get into UA. Bakugo growled at that thought. As kids, they always talked about how they wanted to become a hero. Yet after Deku had his useless quirk, it was clear who of the two would become the next #1 hero. Bakugo was fine if Deku was depressed, because that meant he knew the truth and wouldn't get in Bakugo's way. But now it seemed Deku had illusioned himself with the idea he could become a hero. That meant Deku was better than Bakugo, and Bakugo would never let that be the truth. As Deku walked across the street, Kago waited, then dashed after him. Deku walked across a parking lot, and Bakugo hid behind a small brush. He walked as Deku walked into a building that had a large LED lid sign on the side. What was Deku doing at a building like this? Was Deku going behind Bakugo's back to undermine him, to make fun of him? Was Deku just pretending to be weak to one day shove it in Bakugo's face that he was better? No, if Deku somehow got into UA with his useless quirk, Bakugo would have to remind him of his place. That thought caused Bakugo to yell and run across a small parking lot. He ran after the useless nerd, but by the time Bakugo got close, Deku had already entered the building. He must have heard Bakugo's yell because he turned around. "Oh, hello, Kaken. What are you doing here?" Izuku asked as he locked eyes with his childhood friend through the glass door. He wasn't expecting to see Bakugo here. The only reason would be if Bakugo followed him. Why had Bakugo followed him? "You damn nerd. What the hell do you think you're doing? Especially in a place like this?" Bakugo yelled, demanding an answer. Small explosions went off in his hand. Bakugo was just waiting for the door to automatically open so he could cream Izuku. Yet the door never opened. Izuku looked to the right and the left, then back at Bakugo. "You mean Hatsumi Industries? I work here. I started a bit ago." Izuku explained in a confused tone. "What are you doing here?" What idiot would hire a useless nerd like you, especially at the age of 13? Don't try to lie. You're training to try for the UA entrance exam. Why else would you disappear every day after school and suddenly have a better physique? I told you, I'm going to be the only one from our shitty school that gets into UA. Bakugo said, punching the door, which hurt, since it was made out of reinforced bulletproof glass. Training. Well, I won't say I've been training every day, really only when a hero comes in for repairs. Working out, usually. I didn't like that I was so scrawny looking, so I decided to start lifting weights. As for coming here, I do genuinely work here. Look, Izuku pulled out his wallet. After sifting through some cards, he pulled one out and held it against the door. Bakugo looked at the card. It was an employee ID card for Hatsum Industries, and it had a photo of Izuku on it. As for trying to get into UA, I will say I gave up on that dream growing up, but now some stuff has changed, and now I think I might actually have a chance of getting in. Bakugo looked at Izuku and yelled. He held his hand against the door and lit off an explosion. The door shook a bit, but no crack appeared. Only burn marks were left behind. Young man, Miss Potter, Hatsum Industries receptionist, suddenly appeared behind Izuku. If you try to do that again, I will call the police and have you arrested. Not only for damage to our property, but also for aggravated assault and illegal quirk usage. Surely UA will not allow someone with that record into their school. Bakugo growled, shot a death glare at Izuku, then shoved his hands into his pocket and walked away. Classmate, Ms. Potts asked as Izuku turned around. Yeah, we were once friends, but that didn't last very long, Izuku said, as he and Ms. Potts started to walk back to her desk. Well, if he comes back here, I'll make sure to send him packing. Ms. Potts frowned as she walked around her desk and sat down. Izuku smiled as he remembered Ms. Potts' quirk, mag field, which allows her to manipulate the magnetic fields within her eye line. Izuku suddenly had a thought. Your quirk, that's why Kakin couldn't get through the door. You used your quirk to lock the door after I walked through it. Ms. Potts laughed. You really are a clever one, but the front doors don't have that kind of lock. I heard Kakin's yelling, so I used a button under my desk to lock the door, but I'll tell your idea to the Hatsumis. They might even add some extra protection that only I can activate. Izuku smiled as he walked over to the elevator. As Izuku continued through middle school, he continued to train and practice with pro heroes any chance he could. If he wasn't doing homework or working on a repair order for Hatsum Industries, Izuku was either lifting weights, doing cardio, or taking a jog. And he was pleased with the result he was getting. The only breaks Izuku took were on Saturday and Sunday, and if he didn't have any work to do, he was working on the design of what equipment he would use for UA's entrance exam. Yet, even with only 6 months left until the entrance exam and the last home stretch of middle school almost upon Izuku, he had nothing. Actually, he had a lot, several different inventions. Many of them were his own version of support equipment used by other heroes, yet none of them felt right to Izuku. They all work and would be perfect, but there is an instinctual gut feeling that they weren't meant for Izuku to use. It was a Saturday afternoon with the day soon becoming evening, and Izuku was working in his bedroom. Long gone was his old computer and monitor upon an old desk. To better handle working at Hatsum Industries and support his own invention, Izuku had used his pay to upgrade to the best computer and monitor his money could buy along with a new wooden desk. Izuku was sitting in his chair looking at a repair order from Whiplash as the pro hero had yet again managed the whips within his whips. Izuku had tried several times to get Whiplash to agree to an upgrade, but everything the pro hero shot him down. Now as Izuku looked over the last order, he attempted to just do the upgrade and not tell Whiplash. A knock from his door pulled Izuku from his thoughts. Izuku turned from his monitor and looked towards his door to find Inko standing in the doorway holding a box in her arms. Izuku pushed his chair back and fully turned to face Inko. Hey mom, what's in the box? Inko forced a smile as she worked into her son's room and sat down on his bed, placing the box next to her. Inko then looked down at the floor. Then after a deep breath, she looked up at her son. Izuku, honey, what I'm about to say it might be hard for you. Your father has been dead for some time, since you were 11. Inko waited for Izuku to react, but he was frozen. The only movement was a small burst of green electricity behind his eyes. Once the green lightning started, Izuku said in a hollow breath, "Is that why you've been worried about paying the bills?" Inko took a sharp breath. "I noticed you throwing them away one day. Haven't missed you doing that since." Inko's eyes began to tear up just as Izuku's eyes did. She began nodding quickly and said, "Your father paid for everything through his job. He took care of all the payments. But since he's died, I've been having to dive into our savings. And we're going to be running out soon. I've been looking for a job, but nothing has come through." Inko dropped her face in her hands and began to cry. Izuku was instantly by her side, hugging her. "I'm sure everything will work out. And thank you for telling me that my father is dead. He might have left us, but—" "Izuku, he didn't just leave us, he abandoned us. Left me to raise you by myself, making me stress every day where he was. The only communication from him was the check to pay for everything. He abandoned us. You. All over your Quirk." Inko said in a broken voice. All the feelings she had been hiding from her son were now coming out. "Okay, he abandoned us. Left you to raise me. But you've done a good job at being the best mother in the world. We might have had a rough time, but look at the past few months. They've been good. Sure, we might be low on money, but you're looking for a job, and I'm sure someone out there will see how good a worker you are. Until then, let me help with that. My pay isn't high for Hatsum Industries, but I can help a bit." Izuku said as he felt his own eyes become watery, so he hugged his mother more tightly. "How did you become such a gentleman?" Inko asked. "I was raised by a good woman that beat it into my genes." Izuku said with a small chuckle that Inko joined him in through her tears. Then for a few minutes, mother and son embraced each other, reflecting on all the trails they had been through. All the times they had been there for each and the times they hadn't. Times when they should have grown closer together, but ended up further apart. For those few minutes, mother and son enjoyed embracing each other. Then Izuku's attention returned to the box that his mother had brought in. "What's in the box?" Inko wiped the tears from her eyes and cleared her throat as she grabbed the box. "You remember that textbook I gave you?" Izuku nodded as he pointed to the textbook resting on his nightstand. "Well, it wasn't the only thing your father left you." Inko set the box on her lap and pulled the lid off of it. Izuku stood up to look inside the box. He saw there were journals and rolled-up blueprints. Izuku remembered the promise his father had given him when he was a kid. Did the blueprints play any part in that? Izuku grabbed one of the blueprints and, however, sliding off the rubber bands, Izuku began to unroll the blueprint. It was soon too big to fit in Izuku's hands, so he laid it on the ground and used his shoes and hands to keep the blueprint from rolling back up. With the blueprint fully on display, Izuku looked it over. It was extremely detailed, and Izuku recognized his father's handwriting from his textbook. Even the notes would have been written years apart. They all looked the same. It was easy to see what the blueprint was of. It's an exoskeleton. Izuku then thought about what the purpose of it was. To give me super strength to make me move at high speeds. Izuku tilted his head as his eyes landed on a note that was written next to the hands of the exoskeleton. "Hey Mom, can you hand me the other blueprint from the box?" As Inko pulled out the other blueprint, Izuku grabbed the textbook from his nightstand to hold the first blueprint. Izuku stood up, and Inko handed him the second blueprint. After undoing the rubber band, Izuku unrolled the blueprint and read the title of the blueprint, Repulsor Technology Mark I, designed to give flight to those that can't on their own. Izuku moved the second blueprint to the side and looked down at the one on the floor. "Put them together, and you have an exoskeleton that can fly." Izuku looked over the larger blueprint, and his eyes fell on some writing along the line. "Though I may not be able to directly support my son, I believe I can find the knowledge to build a device that can help my son be the hero he always wanted to be. One of the last phone call I got from your father, he told me it was close to finishing the exoskeleton and was going to start working on a device that could use your quirk to power it. But he never built one. He could never solve the riddle of your quirk," Inko said. Izuku looked over the larger blueprint and noticed there wasn't a power source, but Izuku then dropped the smaller blueprint and shoved his hand down his shirt. He grabbed the arc reactor and pulled it off of his chest. Izuku quickly put the arc reactor in the chest area of the exoskeleton. He then stood up and looked it over. The slow glow of the arc reactor sat perfectly in the middle of the exoskeleton as if it was always meant to power it. That riddle was solved by the Hatsums. I didn't think your father's blueprints would be of much use to you. But then the Hatsums showed us their arc reactor. And after how well it works. I've known you've always wanted to be a hero, and I know I can't give you the tools to be one, but I give you these. With what you've learned from the Hatsums, I believe your father's invention will work and you can become a hero. Inko started to cry and Izuku comforted her, but soon his own waterworks broke and he began to cry. Again, emotion ran high as Izuku and Inko made a silent promise to themselves to always be there for the other. They continued to hug and cry until Inko said it was time to retire to bed. After brushing his teeth and getting ready, Izuku sat down on his bed and looked at the blueprints again. They were extremely precise, leaving no room to make minor adjustments. Obviously, his father had spent a long time revising these blueprints to get the best design. Izuku began to smile as he continued to look over the blueprint. Getting a sense of how hard his father had worked to design these, Izuku quickly stood up and scooped the blueprints off the ground. They didn't deserve to be on the ground. Izuku looked all over his room, but with all his All Might posters, he didn't have any room to have the blueprints up. Sorry, All Might, Izuku said, as he quickly but carefully began to pull out the thumbtack. After rolling up the poster and slipping it into his closet, Izuku hung up the two blueprints. After making sure they were secure on the wall, Izuku took a step back. Now being about to take in the complexity of the design from a distance, Izuku knew he was going to need some help. And he knew a girl that would be willing to give some. Izuku grabbed his phone from his nightstand and called Mei. She immediately picked up. No, I didn't almost blow up my shop again. Izuku grinned as he seemed to have a sixth sense for whenever Mei blew something up. No, I'm not calling because I felt something. No, I was wondering, mind clocking in some overtime helping me on a project. What do you have? Mei asked. Izuku could hear the excitement in her voice as Izuku was finally letting her help on one of his personal projects, though it would have to wait until the weekend was over. Monday after school, Izuku headed to Hatsum Industries and was not surprised to find Mei waiting for him. Izuku walked over to the metal table, set his backpack on the ground, and then pulled out the blueprints. Something my father left me, Izuku said as he unrolled the blueprints on the tables and used magnets to hold them open. Mei moved around the table and began looking them over. Izuku immorality noticed Mie's eyes zooming around, in and out, absorbing all the details of the blueprints. After a whole minute, Mei let out a breath and said, "You said your father designed these." Izuku nodded. Midoriya, this isn't just something new. This is groundbreaking, and using your quirk as the power source, we might just get them to work. Think we're up to the challenge? Izuku asked. Mei looked the blueprints over again and then looked at Izuku. Only one way to find out. With that, Izuku and Mei set out building Hisashi's designs. They decided to first tackle the gauntlets, as Izuku pointed out they would be best to have for the entrance exam, whatever it entailed. It was slow going in the beginning, turning the blueprints into 3D models and having the pieces cut out. Yet once all the metal pieces were cut out, Izuku began wielding them together, while Mei began working on the wiring. Once the wireframe of the gauntlets was all together and wired, the two of them ran into a bit of a roadblock. Hisashi's design of the repulsor that sat in the palm of the hand didn't work. It took a bit to find the focus point of the repulsors was the issue, as they would either burn out or just explode entirely, but Izuku and Mei kept at it, testing every little change they could think of, starting up late to do so. Until 4 months before UA's entrance exam, they hit a breakthrough and got everything working. With everything seemingly now working, Izuku began video recording all the different tests. Hatsum Industries database accessed. Izuku Midoriya personal drive accessed. Password asterisk 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 asterisk. Video 1 accessed. Please press enter. Click. Today is Monday, October 9th, 2034. The time is 3:45 in the afternoon. Izuku said as he walked into the frame, checking his phone. He slid his phone into his pocket as he turned to face the camera. He was wearing his arc reactor, which had several wires traveling down his arms to a pair of wireframe gauntlets. In the palm of each gauntlet was a glowing disc. Mei's parents had been kind enough to clean and given the 3rd floor of Hatsum's Industries for testing. Today is test number 1 of the Repulsor Gauntlets Mark 1. The objective of the day is to see whether these things actually work or not. On camera, we have Dummy, and on fire safety, May Hatsum. The camera swung slightly to show May holding a fire extinguisher, then moved back to Izuku. I'll be starting halfway back from the center. Izuku moved into position. He double-checked everything was connected, then flexed his finger. The arc reactor glowed for a bit, and then the repulsors hummed a bit, causing Izuku to smile. Alright, we'll start with low power. 10%, and see how that feels. I have stationary targets at 5 yards, 10 yards, and 20 yards. The camera switches views to show the targets, red plates that were hanging from the ceiling from metal wires. After the last target was shown, the camera switched back to Izuku. I think you forgot to credit another inventor, May said as she crossed her arm. She might not be the most social person, but something she held close to her chest was giving the credit owed to people when they helped with a project. Oh yes, the designs were made by Hisashi Sataku and built by myself and May Hatsum, Izuku said as he rolled his shoulders and loosened up his body to get ready for anything that could happen. This was new technology, and while Izuku had an idea of what they were to do, anything could happen. Alright, remember, half mark from the back with 10% power. In 3, 2, 1. Izuku lifted both his hands and extended his fingers. He took a deep breath, then flexed his fingers. The arc reactor pulsed green, and green electricity traveled down the loose wires to the repulsors. Both hummed for a bit before both fired out an energy blast. Izuku tried to hold his ground, but the force behind the blast sent him flying back across the room. Izuku backflipped across the floor until his back hit the wall. He stayed attached to the wall for a bit, but then he groaned as he fell to the ground. May Hatsum ran over and started to spray Izuku with the fire extinguisher. Izuku waved his hands, yelling, "I'm not on fire. I'm not on fire," though the cold was distracting him from the pain that coursed through his entire body. May released the trigger, and Izuku stayed hidden behind a white cloud until the white cloud disappeared, and Izuku slowly got to his feet, his back popping as he straightened his back. He brushed the white foam off of himself as he started to shiver. Alright, I think for the next test we should stay at 1%. Video 1 ended. After the success of the test, Izuku took a few days to rest up and heal from his landing, but then he and May drove back to working on the gauntlets. And now they knew the design worked. They wanted to perfect them. Late nights and all-nighters became more common, but were quickly cut off when their parents noticed how worn out they were during the day. Worried about their son and daughter's health, Inko along with Mr. and Mrs. Hatsum sat the two of them down and set some ground rules. Izuku and May begrudgingly accepted the rules, and knowing how strict their parents could be, made no attempts to bend the rules and see what they could get away with. Hatsum Industries database accessed. Izuku Midoriya personal drive accessed. Password asterisk 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 asterisk. Video 24 accessed. Please press enter. Click. Today is Friday, January 5th, 2035. So this is the first video of the new year, so Happy New Year. The current time is 5:31, and after a short break to celebrate the new year, Hatsum and I have worked tirelessly to improve my gauntlets. Today we will be testing Repulsor Mark 5 and this test number 3. After furthering testing, we found some minor flaws in our improved design in the area of power conversion and distribution. We discovered that during sustained usage, the couplings began to weaken and overheat, resulting in reduced overall power, and what power does get through it is lost almost immediately to heat, meaning we have redesigned the whole repulsor base. As always on camera, we have Dummy, and for a lack of a better replacement, May Hatsum is still on fire safety. Izuku walked into the frame. He was wearing a simple white t-shirt and a pair of jeans. Both were covered in grease stains, and his hair was unkempt and messy. It hung down in front of his face, and he had to brush it out of his eyes. He had a few circles under his eyes, showing a bit of exhaustion. As with every video, he had his gauntlets on, and they were primed to be ready. May huffed off screen. At the end of every test, you have blasted me with CO2, which I always remind you, and you always seem to forget, is minus 73 degrees Celsius. It's cold, Izuku explained as he turned to look at May. Te then turned to look directly at the camera. And let it be on the record that if you douse me again and I'm not on fire, I'm going to Mayhastrom's house and destroying all of her inventions. No, don't hurt my babies. May winced off screen. Izuku saw that she was crossing her arms and pouting. To her, her inventions were her kids, something that Izuku didn't see and would have no problem breaking her toys, especially if it got the point across. Don't douse me when I'm not on fire, and we won't have an issue. Izuku said, then moved into position. As always, I'll be starting a half mark back from the center. We'll start with 1% power, then move up to 2% power. Izuku walked into position and then connected the arc reactor to the repulsor. They slowly hummed to life. In 3, 2, 1, Izuku raised his right hand and fired off a shot, and the energy blast shattered the glass plane in front of Izuku. Izuku then spun around on his feet as he lifted his left hand and aimed it at another plane of glass. With a thought, Izuku's left gauntlets unleashed an energy blast and shattered the glass plane, moving up to 2%. Izuku turned to his left and held up both hands. Even between 1% and 2%, the power increase was obvious as Izuku was nearly caught off balance, but managed to hold his ground, though his shoe squeaked a bit as he pushed back. Then to finish it off, a glass plane was lowered between Izuku and the camera. Izuku turned and unleashed an attack from his right arm. The energy blast rocketed through the air and connected with the glass plane only a meter from the camera. As the glass hit the floor, Izuku stood in the middle, his hand by his side as he let out a breath he didn't know he had. Years of studying and months of building all come to this. Izuku had built his father's design, and they worked. Yes. Izuku cheered as he lifted both hands into the air as if he wanted a double high five. In his excitement, Izuku flexed his finger and his gauntlets went off. Izuku had to take several steps back to stay on his feet. As soon as he regained his balance, he suddenly turned around and pointed a repulsor off-screen. Ah, no. The camera moved slightly to show May creeping forward, an extinguisher in her hands, with the pin pulled and her hand ready to pull the trigger. You want me to destroy your babies? No. May lowered the nozzle. Good choice. Izuku lowered his hand. He looked around at the destroyed glass and realized each of them had been 4 inches thick. His attacks had broken them apart as if they were thin. Izuku looked down at his hand. Just how powerful the repulsor was. Izuku was pulled from his thoughts as May suddenly rushed forward. The nozzle of the fire extinguisher raised and May pulled the trigger. Izuku quickly raised his right and fired at the cloud of CO2 rushing towards him. The attack met in the middle, and then, as if a smoke bomb went off, the room was filled with freezing cold CO2. Izuku coughed a bit and waved his hand in front of his face. He looked around but couldn't spot May. Your babies are dead. May Hatsum. You hear me, dead. Then I'm coming after you. Then the fire extinguisher suddenly rolled into view. Izuku instantly aimed his gauntlets at it, but then he hit the elevator's open door. May was trying to escape. Izuku wasn't going to let that happen. He took off towards the noise, but he knew he wasn't going to make it in time. So Izuku held his hand behind him, and just as his old childhood friend, Izuku unleashed a burst from his hand that rocketed him forward. You're dead, Medi Hatsum. Run all you want, but I know where you live. Izuku yelled. Video to end. Log off. Click. Izuku couldn't believe it as he stood looking up at the front gate of UA. After months of late nights and building his gauntlets over and over, Izuku had arrived. He had gone to bed early the night before just to make sure he would wake up in enough time for UA's hero course entrance exam. It was the next step in fulfilling his dreams of becoming a hero, something he had to take hold of and never let go. Izuku shouldered his backpack as he stepped through and was officially on UA grounds. A warm feeling passed over him as though he had only been seriously working to get him the past 6 months and had been working towards this his entire life. And for some reason, he wasn't as nervous as he thought he would be. He was confident in his equipment and all he had learned from relentlessly being beaten down onto the practice mat. Izuku's right ear was suddenly flicked. It also helped that May had decided to come in to provide moral support, despite UA's entrance exam for the support department not starting for another 2 hours. Come on, May said as he walked past Izuku and headed to the main building where the opening ceremony would happen. Izuku chuckled and was about to follow after her when a cold voice came from behind Izuku. "Get out of the way, Deku!" Kago yelled from behind Izuku. "And I thought I told you not to try and get in." Izuku was pulled from his calming mindset as Bakugo pushed past him, making sure his shoulder hit Izuku. Izuku stepped away from Bakugo and held his tongue. He had been preparing himself not just for the entrance exam, but also for the chance he would run into Bakugo. Izuku thought about saying that Kago couldn't hold him back, and he had every right to take the test, same as everyone else. But Izuku knew that could just get Bakugo all riled up, so he didn't say anything. Izuku waited to give some distance to Bakugo, but when Bakugo reached Mei, Izuku felt his hand reach up behind him and grabbed his back up. He watched as Bakugo looked at Mei, seeming to recognize her. Mei looked back, and though her eyes didn't narrow in anger, Izuku noticed her eyes were zooming in now Bakugo, allowing her to watch for any sudden movement. A habit Izuku had noticed early now, but never asked Mei able. The two of them looked at each other for a minute, then, as if she wasn't worth his time, Bakugo clicked his tongue and continued walking. Izuku exhaled as he was sure Mei was doing the same. He walked up to her and asked, "Are you okay?" "Just fine. Get in there and prove him wrong. And the support exam will have started by the time you're done. Wait up for me," Mei said. Izuku nodded and opened the door and went inside. He followed the arrows that led him to a giant auditorium. Izuku pulled out his phone and opened the marked email that had his seat location. He began walking up the stairs and found that he had an aisle seat. Izuku slipped off his backpack, stored it under his seat, and then sat down. He only had to wait a few minutes before all the lights turned off and the opening ceremony began. "Ha-he-lulu." Izuku instantly recognized the voice from the podcast he always listened to when he got into a zone while he was working on a project. It was the voice hero, Present Mike. He walked onto the stage in his hero costume and continued with the ceremony. First up was the written portion, something that Izuku was never stressed about. Izuku had always been at the top of his class for grades. Even with all the time he spent building and working on projects, Izuku always made sure he found time to do homework and study for any test. Though with how easy he absorbed information, he didn't have to study for long. So after the written tests were handed out and the hour-and-a-half timer began counting down, Izuku looked at the first question and gained a small smirk after seeing how easy the question was. The following questions weren't much more difficult, and Izuku easily breezed his way through the test, though he wasn't above double-checking his work and his answers. But when the timer went off, Izuku was more than confident he had passed as he handed in his test. In exchange for his test, Izuku was given a card that had a letter on it, which Izuku figured was the exam area he was designated to. Izuku then returned to his seat, and the introduction to the physical portion of the test began. Present Mike explained how the test worked and how examinees could earn points by destroying robots. The only small hiccup came when an examinee expressed his confusion over how in the handout there were 4 robots listed by other 3 that had been verbally mentioned. Present Mike explained that the 4th robot is a bit of a secret, and as it is not worth any points, most people stay away from it. With that, everyone got up and headed out of the auditorium, and outside where several buses were waiting to take them to their exam areas. Izuku looked at his card again, and then headed to one of the buses that was marked to go to exam area B. He walked to the back of the bus, choosing not to notice everyone staring at his backpack. Izuku sat down in one of the seats, and then placed his backpack on his legs. The wait for the bus to start moving wasn't long, and soon it was at exam area B. Izuku was one of the last off the bus, and without knowing when the test would begin, Izuku set about getting his equipment on. He walked over to a bench and sat down and pulled out his gauntlets. As Izuku connected all the wiring and tightened the screw, he sensed someone walking up to him. Izuku looked up and saw it was the same blue-haired student who was confused about the robots. "What's with all the equipment?" the blue-haired examinee asked. "It's to help direct my quirk. Made them myself," Izuku said as he tightened the last screw and flexed his finger. The repulsor hummed to life as Izuku felt his quirk get siphoned through his arc reactor and down to his palm. If your quirk requires so much equipment, perhaps it's not suitable for becoming a hero. Perhaps you would have better luck in the support course. What would you do if your equipment was broken in the middle of a fight? The blue-haired examinee asked, in a tone Izuku didn't like. He wasn't asking out of curiosity, but from the same location that all the other pro heroes went to when they realized how much Izuku relied on support equipment. I could still hold my own, Izuku said, as he closed his backpack and set it after the bench. He stood up and began walking away from the blue-haired examinee. He dealt with that attitude from enough pro heroes. He didn't need it from someone who was trying to be a pro hero. Izuku forcefully closed his backpack and then leaned it against the tree. Izuku stood up and looked the blue-haired kid in the eyes, ready to rip him a new one. However, before Izuku could say anything, Present Mix's voice yelled, "Begin." Izuku froze, just as everyone else did. No countdown, no notice, just start. Izuku was quicker to react than everyone else, as he got over the confusion faster by directing his quirk to his mind. With a clear thought forming in Izuku's mind, he took off to the big door that was not open a few seconds ago. Izuku dashed through the frozen examinee and made it to the inside of the fake city. Hold on. The exam area was a whole fake city. How could UA possibly afford to build not just one fake city, but 6 for each exam area? Not getting distracted by that, Izuku came across a one-pointer. Now it was time to see how his equipment held up against something that was built by someone who had years of experience and the funds to build anything. Izuku lifted his right arm, and with a flex of his finger, power built up in the repulsor. After a second, the energy was unleashed into a blast that rocketed towards the one-pointer and hit it in its chest. The attack hit, and then quickly burned a hole through the robot. Izuku's eyes went a little wide as he realized that was not 1 or 2%. He had instinctively increased his power to 5% to make sure he had destroyed the robot. Yet Izuku barely had time to make the change, as 2 more one-pointers came around the corner as if spurred towards Izuku by the sounds of battle. Izuku raised both of his hands and unleashed too much attack. The energy burst hit the robots, but did not burn as the first robot had. Izuku quickly stepped forward, unleashed 2 more attacks, and managed to hit the heads of the 2 one-pointers. As their heads melted away, the robots began to shake until they stopped and fell to the ground. That's 3, as Izuku began to keep track of points. The baseline of who was accepted and who was denied was unknown, but Izuku would like to know how close he was to either. Izuku then noticed that other people were starting to file into the city. They were beginning to attack the robots in the surrounding area. Izuku knew he needed to go to a new location to find more robots, so he began running down the street. Izuku ran down the street until he heard some noise coming from an alleyway. As that couldn't possibly be anything else besides robots, Izuku turned and headed into the alleyway. And just as he disappeared from the corner, a 3-pointer suddenly appeared and tried to punch him. On pure instinct, Izuku managed to dodge the attack, but as he raised his hand, the robot attacked again. The 3-pointer's speed was faster than the others, causing Izuku to panic. Izuku shifted his arm to block the attack, but the 3-pointer's speed wasn't the only improvement. As the robot's fist connected with Izuku's gauntlets, Izuku felt the wireframe quickly bend and deform. Then Izuku was sent flying down the alleyway. As Izuku hit the ground, he used his gauntlets the best he could to protect his arm. Once it stopped sliding, Izuku got to his knee and saw that luckily his gauntlets weren't fully broken. The left one had taken the most damage and probably only had a few shots left, while the right one was only slightly damaged. Yet this made Izuku wish he had added some kind of armor over the gauntlets to provide some protection to himself and the repulsors. Yet he had been so focused on building the repulsors, he hadn't worked on anything else from his father's blueprints. Izuku cursed himself as he got to his feet. Izuku's vision was still a little fuzzy, so he took a deep breath, and the world came back into focus. He looked down the alleyway and saw the 3-pointers. It was staring back at him as if to taunt him. His vision went a little red as he looked at it. Without a second thought, Izuku yelled and rushed forward. Now knowing about its enhanced speed, Izuku easily dodged the robot's punches. He launched himself out of the way of the attack and landed on a dumpster. He used it to springboard over the 3-pointers. Izuku's plan was to land behind the 3-pointer and attack it from behind, but as Izuku landed, he was attacked again. Izuku raised his right arm to block and managed to keep his feet under him as he was pushed back. As he stopped, Izuku rolled his shoulder, then rushed forwards. This time, instead of jumping away, Izuku slid under the 3-pointer's arm and slid under its stomach. Izuku stopped underneath the three-pointer and laid both of his hands flat against its underbelly. Green lightning jumped across Izuku's body as his quirk poured into his arc reactor and shot down into his repulsor. 50%. Immediately, both repulsors gave a near-blinding light and a high-pitched whine before blasting the three-pointer in its weak spot. The metal of the robot groaned for a few seconds, and then the robot melted in half and fell to the ground around Izuku. Izuku's shoulders hit the ground, and it felt like they almost became dislocated. Izuku screamed out in pain as he fell to the ground. He struggled to catch his breath as the pain shot through his shoulders, along with the crash causing a massive headache to cloud Izuku's mind. He could only lay on the ground, breathing through the pain. He lay on the ground until the PA system turned on and said, 1 minute remaining. How long had Izuku been resting on the ground? He only had a minute left, and he only had 6 points. Fighting through the pain, he got up and looked around. He needed to find some robots to destroy, but all the ones in his vicinity had been destroyed. Suddenly, he felt the ground begin to rumble. He looked down the street he was standing on, just in time to have a wave of examinees run past him, though they weren't enough to cause the ground to rumble. However, the giant robot behind them was enough